at Make Positive here in London. I've been working on Salesforce for about 4 years now, and I got my start as a Service Cloud user. So yeah, I started on the user side. I think that gave me a lot of insight kind of into user experience in Salesforce and making things better for users themselves. I was trying to get all of my certification logos on last night, but I guess you can get certifications, but it's very hard to find the logos, so you can just take my word for it. Yeah, and today I'm going to be speaking to you about the life-changing magic of tidying up your Salesforce org. So let me just, oops. Cool. So we're going to be talking about who's Marie Kondo, where I'll introduce you to this very famous professional organizer and author. Then we'll talk about tidying your org and why it matters. And I promise you, it's not going to be boring as it sounds. It's going to be cool. We'll hopefully have some fun today. And then we'll talk about the steps that you can take to get a tidy org. So when I first started administering Salesforce, I was living in a pretty large house in San Francisco. And you can tell this was a long time ago because there are not so many accessible large houses in San Francisco anymore. And most of the hobbies that I had revolved around buying stuff. I went to lots of antiques fairs, and I bought all sorts of vintage furniture and vintage toys. And I just had a ton of space to put stuff in, and I've kind of always collected stuff. And then I moved to London a few years ago, and I moved into a one-bedroom flat, and I had a lot less space. So I was feeling pretty overwhelmed. So around this same time, Marie Kondo had written this book called The Life-Changing Magic of Tidying Up. And it's since been translated into a ton of different languages. It's very popular with people all over the world. And so I read this book because it was quite hot at the time. And I learned kind of her theory is that you need to get rid of stuff in your life that doesn't spark joy for you. And what does that mean, spark joy? So she kind of says that you need to hold an object in your hands, and if it makes you kind of innately happy, then you should keep it. If it doesn't, regardless of how expensive it was, or whether or not it was a gift, or how long you've had it, you should get rid of it. So I liked this idea, and I started going on this sort of cleaning and tidying rampage in my house. And I got rid of clothes and books and all sorts of stuff. And my husband, Matt, was worried that if he stopped sparking joy for me, then I might get rid of him. Luckily, he's very cool, and he's actually much tidier than I am, and he's stuck around. So how does this all relate to Salesforce? You may not have come to this conference to hear about a woman cleaning her house. And I actually showed this slide to some of my colleagues, and they thought it was sexist because I was showing a woman cleaning up, but this is just my favorite movie, so I felt like I needed to show Clueless. Yeah, so how does this all relate to Salesforce? So around the same time that I was going on this tidying journey in my personal life, I had also started a job at a company that had a huge amount of turnover on the Salesforce team on a pretty short period of time. So let me just ask a question of the folks in the room. Put your hand up if you've ever inherited a Salesforce org or opened a Salesforce org for the first time and felt extremely overwhelmed. Yeah, that sounds about right. So I was feeling this way, and I think sometimes people don't understand that doing Salesforce admin and developing and consulting can be pretty overwhelming. So I felt like in order to be successful in my job as an admin, I needed to understand how Salesforce worked together. And in order to do that, I was going to have to start to unpick what was happening in Salesforce and really understand how things worked so that I could do my job well. So why might you go on this similar type of tidying journey? So the first one is really selfish. Your job's going to be a lot easier. If you only have the essential functionality in Salesforce, you're going to be able to make changes that you need to when people are requesting it, and you're going to be able to build new functionality in a much clearer way. Your users are also going to have a better experience, because I know sometimes it feels like maybe you're the only person that uses Salesforce, but you're working for your users, so you want them to have a good experience. And if the business processes that they follow are really clear and really make sense, their day-to-day jobs are going to be a lot more enjoyable. The next one is karma. So you want to leave this org in a better place than how you found it. I'm guessing you're probably not going to be in the same job or role for your whole career. Some of us will, but many of us won't. So you want to make things nice for the next person. The next one is limits. So Salesforce uses multi-tenancy, as we know. And one of the reasons that multi-tenancy works really well is limits. And you're going to be a lot less likely to hit up against limits if you're only having functionality that really, really makes sense for your business. Are you guys cold in here? Yeah, it's like really cold. The next one is your own job satisfaction, and I think this one is really important. So this type of work I don't think is particularly glamorous. You're not creating new and shiny and amazing functionality, but it's really important work, and I think it's something that can teach you a lot about the way that Salesforce works. So when I was starting off on this, I was sort of like, oh, where am I supposed to start? So I started with the Salesforce Optimizer report. Has anyone used it? Yeah? Cool. So it's something that you can launch right from the setup menu, and it kind of gives you an overview of whether or not you're using Salesforce in the most optimal way. And I think it's a really good place to start because it can kind of start to make you think about the places in your org that might need more attention. So this particular page of the Optimizer report is just saying, in my developer org, I have one page layout that isn't assigned to any record types. So that might be something that we're not using, so something we could potentially discard. So I also started with a spreadsheet, which I know is sort of maybe a little bit controversial. We're trying not to use so many spreadsheets when we're using Salesforce, but I really like spreadsheets. So I used a spreadsheet, and I created a tab for each type of metadata. And I started with workflow rules. And I went through and I sort of listed out all of the workflow rules, the label, the API name. I know it can seem kind of tedious, but the most important part that you're going to add is a description in really clear and simple language that is going to be for your users to better understand what each thing does. Because I'm guessing a lot of you are maybe admins or devs and can understand what a workflow rule does by just reading the criteria and understanding what that means. But I'm guessing your users probably do not have the time to do that or don't understand it. So you want to be really clear of why you think this is in the org, and you can even give a recommendation of whether or not you still think it's necessary. And as you're going through this process, I would continue to go back to Marie Kondo and sort of think, does this piece of metadata spark joy? And so I know that sounds a little bit far-fetched. So what does that really mean with Salesforce? So you might say kind of, does this piece of metadata have business value? Is it helping our business? How is it driving our business forward? So kind of thinking about the why of why this is here and how it's helping you. So I'm going to go through quite a lot of places that I tidied in this particular org. Anyone that's used Salesforce can probably tell you that I'm missing some. So these are just suggestions to kind of get you started on your own tidying journey. So I started with automation. The org that I was working in had a ton of time-based workflow rules, some of which were competing with each other. We were hitting our limits of having the maximum number of time-based workflow things happening every single day. So it was a little bit crazy. Some of the workflow rules were sending emails internally, but some of them were also external. So it was something that I felt like was a very, very high priority because it was both client-facing and making things a little bit insane. So I would say that workflow rules and process builder, any sort of automation should be your first priority, even if you don't have craziness with time-based workflow rules. Then I looked at fields, and this was, I think we can all admit that sometimes people are like, oh, it's just one field. But over time, there can be so many fields, and as an admin, you need to understand why all of those are there. And this was really helpful to me because I was quite new at the company, so I really needed to understand the purpose of each field in each object. So again, this process can be somewhat time-consuming, but it does pay off. It's worth it. Next, I looked at custom objects. For this, you really want to make sure that each custom object has a really clear business purpose and that the relationships between objects are really clear and well-defined. And this is also going to help you understand the data model better. The next level of places that I looked at started with installed packages, so things from the App Exchange. The org that I was working in had Dupe Catcher installed, and since we had installed Dupe Catcher, there was now like out-of-the-box duplicate management. And there were also quite a few apps that nobody was using at all. Maybe people had installed as a trial and sort of never went forward with it. So it's a pretty easy place to start cleaning. Profiles and permission sets are really helpful for you as an admin. The org that I was working in had 35 custom profiles, which for the size of the org was kind of absurd. So I used a tool called Perm Comparator that allowed me to compare the profiles and permission sets kind of at the individual permission level to see the similarities and to maybe be able to combine some of those. So I was able to get the number from 35 down to 15, which was much more helpful to me when I was doing user management. And I would say a good rule of thumb is permission sets, I think it's okay to have a ton of them as long as you're using them because they can be really helpful. And then I also looked at report types. I think this is one that's often overlooked. I know that I've definitely been guilty of just creating report types, realizing it's the wrong type, it's not right, I don't have a good name, I don't have a clear naming convention, and then I never use it, and maybe it's still there. So cleaning those out, making sure that there's no duplicates, making sure you're using clear naming conventions, and making sure that you're adding in default fields that really make sense, so that when someone goes to create a report, they get fields, and they have a positive experience creating reports. And then the last level is a little bit more cosmetic, but still very important. So I looked at lightning pages and page layouts and making sure those are actually being used and have a really clear definition of why they're being used. The org I was working in had lots of different page layouts, and they kind of had one for each job role, but they were very, very similar. So being able to combine those and understand why you have separate ones, if people need separate ones for what they do in their jobs, or if you're just doing it for the sake of kind of separating people by profile. Record types is also really important. The optimizer report's going to give you a good idea of whether or not record types are really being used. So that's quite a helpful one. And then the last one is kind of like me being a little bit anal about Salesforce, but folders can get out of hand really quickly. And this will be for email templates and reports and dashboards, and your users are going to have a much better experience if they're able to find what they're looking for. So that really makes things easier for them. So here's just a kind of a slide that just shows you all of these things we just talked about. And I would definitely say that there's more. These are just sort of where I looked, some of the key ones that I looked at. But there are so many other places you can tidy, so this will just start you off on your journey. Let's just give you guys a minute. Okay, cool. Okay, so up until this point, you've pretty much been working on this project by yourself. And maybe with Dylan McKay, if anyone gets the reference, is as old as me. Yeah, so you've pretty much been working by yourself, which I think for a lot of people in the Salesforce world can be a very unique experience because you don't usually work in a silo. But ultimately, there are other people that use Salesforce, so you're going to need to involve them. And why is that? So you're going to want their buy-in. You're going to want to make sure that they feel like this is something really cool and positive that you're all doing together, and not something that you're just doing to them and changing their jobs without their input, because it's ultimately going to change the way that they work day to day. They also probably have knowledge that you don't have of different business processes. They maybe have a really different background than you, or a different role, or they've been at the company way longer than you. So you're going to want to make sure that all of your collective knowledge pulls together so you're making the best choices when you're choosing to remove stuff from Salesforce. And also you want to have the accountability. So I can say that probably earlier on in my career, I've definitely been guilty of just deleting things that I thought were irrelevant. And it's really fun when you get a frantic email or phone call from someone saying, hey, I can't do my job, and you know that it's your fault. So you're going to want to cover yourself so you don't get in that situation, and so that you are getting sign-off on things and doing these in the best practice way. So I would recommend speaking with people in person as a first step. And I would definitely include both junior and senior stakeholders, because likely your junior stakeholders are going to be using Salesforce a lot more day to day, and you really want to get their input so that it's not just the big bosses signing off. And then once you've gotten sign off from people, you can even send them that spreadsheet that you put together that you spent a huge amount of time on to actually get their sign off in there. And once you have gotten that sign off and you feel satisfied with the list of things that you're removing and you've talked to the relevant people, you can speak to everyone again. And this is anyone that has any connection to Salesforce. They might not be a user, but maybe it affects them in their day-to-day job. And you're going to explain to them what you're removing, why. If there's any sort of new process in place, and if there is a new process, you're going to make sure you send them any documentation if you have it. And then I think the most important thing is that you make sure you're really accessible to people. So this is something that is change for people. Change is hard for people, and you want to be able to get their feedback and suggestions and make it feel like you're very available to them if they have any sort of issues with any of the stuff you're removing. So you're finally getting to the end of the process. It's really exciting. You've done all this hard work. You've basically picked through your entire org, which is a huge task. You've talked to probably majority of people in the company that are relevant, so you've probably met a lot of people, and it's been hard. You've gone through a lot of hard work. And I think you're finally getting to the end. It's getting pretty exciting. So I would definitely start small. So you're going to want to remove access to things. So that means like page layouts, deactivating processes, deactivating validation rules, removing access to certain fields. And all of these changes are pretty minimal. So you're going to make it so that if you needed to, you could roll any of this back at any time very, very quickly. And so after you've done that, you're going to wait. And this part is very hard for me. I'm very impatient, and I find this part hard. But in this waiting period is kind of to make sure that your business can still run day to day, that your customers can still pay you money, that people can do their jobs. And during this time, you're going to have to be really, really available to people. So there are problems, or people are having issues with doing their jobs or feeling like things are too crazy for them. You need to be very understanding and very available to fix problems as soon as they come up. So it's a good time. And you're going to kind of, I think this time sort of depends on how big your org is. It could be anywhere from a couple of weeks to a couple of months, maybe even longer. I think you can sort of gauge that for yourself of how long you feel like things have been going okay before you're ready to go on to the next step. And then the next one is going into a sandbox. And this one is my favorite step because I feel like you kind of get to practice deleting stuff. And this is the step where you really learn a lot about how different pieces of metadata work together. Because anyone who's ever deleted anything can tell you that often you try to delete something, it says like, oh, well, that field is being used by that process builder or that flow, and you can't delete it. So you kind of have to think about how things are interconnected. And I think that type of work is really what teaches you a lot about kind of how things work together in Salesforce. So that's quite cool. And in the sandbox, you're going to sort of treat it in the same way that you would like any sort of testing. So it's just different in this case because you're not adding functionality, you're just removing it. So run any sort of tests that you would in the same way, using the same resources that you would if you're adding new functionality. And then the next one, I think, is a good and necessary step to kind of sticking with best practices here. So you're going to back things up. So I would recommend doing this with the Force.com IDE and getting an XML file of all the metadata. And if that just went totally over your head as an admin, I feel like it is definitely something admins can do. Also, if your company or organization is using any sort of source control program like Git, that's also going to really help you here. And then once you feel like you've kind of taken this backup, you get to the very final step, and it's pretty exciting. You've done a lot of hard work. And At this point, it's pretty manual. Most of it is through the setup menu, and you're just going to go in and click delete, 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 delete a lot of times, and that might seem tedious, but I think at this point it's really exhilarating. It's sort of the same excitement that you get from bringing a bag of stuff to a charity shop or giving it away to someone. So you really have like accomplished a lot, so you should feel very excited. So what are you going to do to make sure that you don't get back to that crazy, untidy place again once you've done all this very, very hard work to make it tidy? So Marie Kondo says in her book, which I think is a very hopeful thing, that once you've done your massive tidying effort, that you're never going to get back to that place of untidiness again. And I think maybe that's true for someone personally, but in Salesforce, I think you need to be very vigilant about making sure that everyone on your team and everyone that interacts with Salesforce is very thoughtful, that they're only adding sort of spark joy worthy things to Salesforce. And if things are no longer relevant, that you're removing them as you need to. So it's kind of an ongoing journey of sort of being mindful about Salesforce as much as you can be. I just have a couple of suggested trailhead modules that I think are cool: data modeling and data quality. And I'll take questions if anyone has any. Yeah?
You mentioned one tool there that you use, the code comparator. Is there any other tools that you suggest how useful fields?
I think the optimizer report is really good. Like, I haven't like dug into it as much as I feel like I should have for having prepared to talk about it, but it's really good because it kind of gives you a breakdown of so many different things, and it's going to do a lot of the work for you. So while I think it is really, really helpful to do that big spreadsheet, but it's very time consuming. So if you want to sort of start smaller and sort of get an idea of sort of some low-hanging fruit of things you can jump on right away, I would definitely recommend the optimizer report. It's a good one for this type of work. Yeah, perm comparator is good too, but as I was using it, one of my colleagues pointed out that when you use that kind of tool, you don't really know so much about like the data security of it because it's just like a site that someone's put up. So I would sort of take that into consideration as well if you have customer data. So it's a good tool, I think, for maybe certain things, but be vigilant about it as well.
Can we use any tools for documenting the metadata and the workflows? Is there any easiest way for that?
There's probably, I don't know, as I was going through this, I feel like it is really tedious.
Column copy where you
Yeah.
click and just take all the...
Yeah, I think that, what's it called? What's it called, Ricky? Octopus, okay. Okay, cool. Yeah, no, that's probably helpful. And then maybe you could, once you've exported that, you could go through and kind of do your exercise without copying and pasting. I didn't do that for every single thing, but yeah, no, it is very tedious and would probably be like a full-time job in itself. Yeah, I get that. Yeah.
Do you mind if I make a suggestion?
Yeah.
Because I'm working with a large financial services company at the moment. We're basically doing a similar sort of thing to you, not quite as technical, but documenting their org. And we're using this tool called elements.cloud. So the reason I mention it is because they've actually got a stand here today. And one of the things it does is you synchronize it with the org, and it brings in all the metadata, the custom objects, and so on. But then the reason that's important is it kind of reminded me of your spreadsheet. So rather than have it there as a spreadsheet,
Yeah.
you then start to document it.
Sure.
It's very easy to get users involved in the business to collaborate on, what are we using this for? What's the reason? Because what's really interesting is that this particular company, they've done a lot of stuff in their org, and then people have left, and no one knows, why did we create this custom object? Why have we got this field? So it's a great way to document it.
Yeah, no, I definitely think like more documentation is always better. Yeah, and if there are tools that will save people time, I think when I was doing it, it was quite a small org, but especially with a larger scale, more enterprise org, you're not going to have the time to do that.
On the flip side of that as well, when you're creating stuff and adding rather than taking away, try and be mindful of populating the help text and description fields on things that can be created there, because that's going to help future you later when you can't remember why the hell these things in your org in the first place.
Yeah.
Things change.
Yeah.
Departments change. They get ripped out almost. And
Yeah.
you've got to go, oh, well, no department, right, you can get rid of all these fields.
Yeah, totally. To kind of segment stuff, for sure.
Julia, just one question.
Sorry, I think we're
done?
running over it. If you have any more questions from outside?
Yep, that's fine.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Yes.